The night was cold and quiet when Officer Nathan Doyle received an urgent call over the radio. The dispatcher's voice was tense. Possible case of animal cruelty in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Possible illegal captivity. Any available units? Respond. A strange chill ran down Nathan's spine. Beside him, his canine partner, Kale, a sharp-witted German shepherd, perked up his ears and let out a low grunt, as if he already sensed something was wrong. Nathan grabbed the radio and responded, "Officer Doyle, en route." When he arrived at the location, the warehouse looked completely deserted. Cracked walls, rusted metal sheets barely holding onto the structure, and an eerie silence that made every sound seem louder. Kale hopped out of the patrol car first, sniffing the air with intensity. Nathan followed cautiously, the stench of rust and burnt oil filling his nose. He pushed open the metal door, which creaked loudly, echoing through the empty space. The warehouse seemed abandoned for years, but something was definitely inside. He could feel it. Then, a sound broke the silence. A weak, almost pleading whimper. Nathan froze for a second and exchanged a quick glance with Kale, who instantly went on high alert. He followed the sound, shining his flashlight into a dark corner of the warehouse. His heart clenched at the sight. A small German shepherd puppy, trembling inside a rusted cage, wide eyes filled with fear. Its tiny paws pressed against the metal bars as if begging to be freed. Nathan moved slowly, keeping his breathing steady. The cage's lock was rusted shut, wrapped in thick chains, a clear sign that the poor pup had been trapped there for a long time. He crouched down and reached out a hand, speaking in a calm, low voice. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay now. I'm getting you out of here." But just as he reached for the chains, Kale let out a deep, warning growl. His entire body tensed. Nathan's instincts kicked in immediately. He scanned the warehouse, his hand moving toward his gun. He knew this behavior from Kale all too well. They weren't alone. Nathan's pulse quickened. He knew Kale never reacted like that without reason. Keeping his hand near his holster, he slowly turned his head, scanning the darkness of the warehouse. The flashlight beam flickered across broken crates and rusted machinery, but nothing seemed out of place. And yet, the heavy silence felt suffocating, charged with an unseen presence. Kale's growl deepened, his posture rigid, ready to strike. That's when Nathan heard it. A soft scrape against the concrete floor, coming from the far end of the warehouse. Someone was there. With a slow and steady movement, Nathan positioned himself in front of the puppy's cage, shielding it as his instincts took over. "Police!" he called out, his voice firm. "If someone's in here, step out now." The only response was the distant creak of metal shifting. Nathan's fingers wrapped around his gun, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He had been in enough tense situations to know that sometimes patience was the key. But Kale wasn't waiting. The dog barked sharply, pulling against his stance, his nose flaring as he caught a scent. Then, out of the shadows, something moved. A dark silhouette darted between the rusted beams in the back of the warehouse. Nathan barely caught a glimpse before it disappeared again. His muscles tensed. Whoever it was, they weren't running away. They were circling. He could hear footsteps now, deliberate and slow, echoing through the vast emptiness of the building. His mind raced. Was this just an illegal breeder abandoning dogs? Or was there something much worse happening here? The puppy whimpered behind him, pressing itself against the cage bars. Nathan clenched his jaw. He couldn't waste any more time. "Kale, stay," he ordered firmly. He had to move fast, but he also couldn't leave the dog vulnerable. Taking a steadying breath, he reached into his utility belt and pulled out a bolt cutter. His hands worked quickly, snapping through the rusted chains wrapped around the cage. The lock broke apart with a loud crack, and the door creaked open. The puppy flinched but didn't move, too scared to run. Just as Nathan reached to scoop the dog into his arms, a sudden crash exploded through the warehouse. The sound of metal slamming against metal sent echoes bouncing off the walls. Kale barked furiously, turning toward the noise, his body low and ready to strike. Nathan spun around, gun drawn this time, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The The flashlight beam cut through the dust in the air, landing on the far side of the building, just in time to see a second pair of glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a person. It was another dog, a fully grown German Shepherd. And it wasn't alone. Nathan's grip tightened on his gun as his flashlight illuminated the pair of glowing eyes staring back at him. A fully grown German Shepherd stood at the edge of the darkness, its body tense, ears pinned back, and teeth bared. The low, guttural growl that filled the warehouse sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just any dog. This was the puppy's mother, and she was furious. Kale was already locked onto the larger dog, muscles coiled, ready to attack if necessary. But Nathan hesitated. His instincts screamed that this wasn't an ordinary stray. This mother had been trapped in this place, just like her pup. The way she moved, low and cautious, showed a protective desperation rather than outright aggression. She's not attacking. She's warning me. Nathan slowly lowered his gun, keeping his voice calm. Easy, girl. I'm not here to hurt your pup. The mother dog took a step forward, her powerful frame still tense, her deep brown eyes flicking between Nathan and her baby. The puppy whimpered inside the cage, torn between fear and recognition. Nathan's heart pounded. If she saw him as a threat, she would fight to the death. He had seen what a German Shepherd could do when protecting its own. She could rip through flesh in seconds. He needed to gain her trust, and fast. Kale let out a low whine, and for the first time, the mother's gaze shifted to him. It was a silent moment of recognition. Two of the same breed, two protectors facing each other. Nathan saw the hesitation in her stance, the way her tail flicked slightly. She was wary, but she hadn't lunged. It was a chance. Slowly, Nathan knelt beside the cage, careful not to make any sudden movements. He reached inside, lifting the trembling puppy into his arms. The mother let out a sharp bark, stepping forward. Nathan's pulse spiked, but he held his ground. I'm getting him out, he said softly. The pup clung to his uniform, its tiny body shaking. He turned slightly, letting the mother see that he meant no harm. Her ears flicked forward, and for a long, tense moment, she didn't move. Then, as if making a decision, she took another cautious step, this time toward him. Before Nathan could react, a loud metallic clang shattered the moment. The mother dog whipped her head around, ears perked. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps. Someone else was inside the warehouse. And whoever it was, they weren't alone. Nathan's body went rigid as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They were coming straight for him. The mother dog let out a sharp, warning bark, stepping protectively in front of Nathan and her pup. Kale's stance shifted, his body low, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. Nathan tightened his hold on the puppy and instinctively reached for his radio. But before he could call for backup, a shadow moved between the rusted beams. Put the damn dog down, a rough voice growled from the darkness. Nathan swung his flashlight toward the voice, revealing a man stepping out from behind a stack of wooden crates. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dirty jacket and boots covered in mud. His face was partially obscured by a cap, but his posture screamed aggression. Behind him, another figure lurked, barely visible in the dim light. There was more than one. Nathan's gut twisted. This wasn't just some abandoned warehouse. These men weren't squatters or random trespassers. They were here for the dogs. You've got about 3 seconds to back off, Nathan said firmly, shifting his stance. Kale let out a warning bark, and the mother dog growled beside him, her muscles taut like a spring ready to snap. The man sneered, taking another step closer. He wasn't afraid, and that told Nathan one thing: this guy had done this before. You cops always think you're the ones in control, the man scoffed, glancing at his partner. But you don't know what you're walking into. Nathan's jaw clenched. Dogfighting clicked in his mind all at once. The locked cages, the scars on the mother's body, the abandoned warehouse. These men had been using this place for something illegal. And now that he had found them, They weren't going to let him walk out so easily. He took a half step back, shifting his weight. The exit was too far. He was outnumbered, and he was holding a terrified puppy in his arms. Then, without warning, the man lunged, and all hell broke loose. The man lunged fast, his dirty hands reaching for Nathan's arm. But the officer reacted in an instant. With a sharp pivot, he dodged to the side, keeping the trembling puppy securely in his grip. The man lost his balance for a split second, and that was all Cale needed. With a furious snarl, the German Shepherd launched himself at the attacker, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's forearm. A scream of pain filled the warehouse as the man fell backward, thrashing as he tried to shake Cale off. But the dog held firm, his teeth sinking deeper, his growl reverberating through the air like a warning. This fight wasn't over. Nathan barely had time to process before the second man moved. Out of the shadows, the accomplice reached for something tucked under his jacket. Nathan's instincts screamed at him, a gun. Without hesitation, he acted. Dropping low, he tightened his grip on the puppy and fired a single warning shot into the air. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the metal walls, and the second man froze in place. His hand hovered just inches from the weapon tucked into his waistband, but his expression flickered with uncertainty. "Drop it!" Nathan barked, his voice firm, unwavering. His pulse was pounding, but his hands remained steady, gun trained on the man's chest. The mother dog, standing just feet away, let out a low, guttural growl, her teeth bared, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the sharp breaths of the struggling man on the ground and the heavy panting of the dogs. Nathan could see it, the hesitation in the second man's eyes, the frantic calculation of whether he could grab the gun before Cale or the mother dog got to him. Cale, sensing the shift in power, released his grip on the first man just long enough to whip his head toward the second. His sharp eyes locked onto his next target. The second man's confidence crumbled. Swallowing hard, he slowly lifted his hands, letting the gun clatter onto the dusty concrete floor. All right, he spat. "Just call off your damn dogs." Nathan kept his gun raised as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Doyle. I need immediate backup at my location. 2 suspects in custody, possible illegal dogfighting operation. Send animal control as well. Over." Static crackled for a brief second before the response came through. "Copy that, Officer Doyle. Units are en route. Hold tight." Relief washed over Nathan for a brief second, but only a second, because the mother dog wasn't done yet. With the immediate threat neutralized, her focus shifted. The tension in her body didn't ease. Instead, she turned to the man who had just attacked Nathan, the one who had been holding her baby captive. And this time, she wasn't just warning. She was ready to strike. The air inside the warehouse grew heavier, almost electric with tension. The mother dog's body was still trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper, a rage born of pain, captivity, and the stolen cries of her pup. Her eyes were locked on the man Cale had just subdued. He groaned, barely able to lift himself, blood dripping from his torn sleeve, but the sound was enough. She moved, slow at first, deliberate. Her growl was low, almost a rumble, and it echoed like thunder inside the metal shell of the building. Nathan stepped back instinctively, still holding the puppy, his voice low but firm. "Easy, girl. It's over," he said, though even he wasn't sure it was. But to her, it wasn't over. Not yet. She stepped over broken chains and shattered wood, her eyes never leaving the man who had kept her imprisoned, who had probably kicked her, starved her, hurt her. Nathan could see it in her posture. She remembered every moment, every scream, every hour her pup cried and she couldn't reach him. Now, with her baby safe and the men on the ground, her primal instinct surged forward. Retribution. "Stand down," Nathan warned again, his voice cutting through the silence. Cale stood alert beside him, eyes darting between his partner and the mother. For a second, Nathan thought she would listen. Her steps slowed, her ears flicked back. She hesitated. But then, The man on the ground, stupid, desperate, muttered something under his breath and tried to sit up. It was the final spark. With a sudden, furious lunge, she charged. Her powerful body collided with the man's chest, sending him crashing backward with a guttural scream. Teeth bared, she snapped not to kill, but to punish. She didn't go for his throat. She went for the hand he raised against her. Nathan ran forward, yelling, "Off! Off!" But the dog didn't budge. Her rage had taken control. It wasn't just about this moment. It was everything he'd done, everything he'd taken from her. Nathan had a decision to make, and just seconds to make it. Let her continue or stop her. Either way, something would change. Nathan's heart pounded against his ribs as he watched the mother dog unleash a fury that had been building for who knows how long. The man beneath her screamed, struggling, but not even Cale moved to stop her. It was as if the entire warehouse had frozen in a single, raw moment of truth. Pain answering pain. Her jaws didn't go for vital organs. She didn't aim to kill. She went for the limbs, the hands, the symbols of power that had once controlled her. Nathan took a single step forward, cradling the puppy tightly against his chest. He knew this couldn't go on much longer. Backup was on the way, and the last thing he needed was for this scene to end with a bullet, especially not one meant for her. But part of him understood. Maybe too much. He'd seen what cruelty could do to people. But when it was done to an animal, a creature that couldn't speak, couldn't fight back in human terms, it twisted something inside them. This wasn't revenge. This was instinct wrapped in trauma. "Cale, heel," he said softly. The command wasn't meant for Cale. It was a signal, a cue. Cale moved slowly, circling around the mother dog's flank, his ears lowered, his tail low and calm. He wasn't a threat. He was communicating in a language only they understood, canine to canine. Nathan crouched slightly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "That's enough, girl. He's not hurting anyone anymore. You've already won." For a tense, aching moment, she didn't respond. Her jaws stayed clamped around the man's forearm, though not as tightly. Blood trickled down his arm. His cries had faded into pitiful whimpers. Then, she blinked. Slowly, her muscles loosened, her breathing changed, and just like that, she released him. She stepped back, her body still trembling, her eyes wary. Nathan didn't make any sudden moves. Cale stood beside her now, calmly, like a soldier guarding a comrade. The man on the ground curled into himself, sobbing, shaking, mumbling curses and pleas no one cared to hear. Nathan rose to his feet, clutching the pup closer, and reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, situation contained. Suspects detained. No shots fired. We need animal control and a medic. Officer is safe. Dogs are safe," he said, exhaling for the first time in what felt like forever. As he spoke, the mother dog turned to him, her eyes softer now. Tired, broken, but grateful, and in that look he saw everything. What she had endured, what she had protected, and what it had cost her. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder. But inside that warehouse, in that moment, the real rescue had already happened. The flashing lights of patrol cars bathed the warehouse walls in red and blue as the cavalry finally arrived. Officers poured in, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every corner. Paramedics rushed to the injured suspect, who now lay curled in a pathetic heap, his arm a bloodied mess of torn flesh and shattered pride. But Nathan didn't look at him. He was focused on the two dogs in front of him, the silent survivors of something darker than anyone outside those walls would understand. Animal control entered cautiously, leading with poles and leashes, but Nathan raised a hand. "No," he said firmly. "She's not a threat. Neither of them are." His voice carried the kind of weight that didn't invite argument. Cale stood protectively between the mother and the strangers, while the pup, still cradled in Nathan's arms, had stopped shaking. There was something about his breathing now, slower, calmer, like he knew he was finally safe. One of the officers approached Nathan quietly. "You good?" he asked, his tone more concerned than casual. Nathan nodded, but something in his eyes said otherwise. He looked back at the mother dog, now lying on the cold concrete beside Kale. Her body was exhausted, barely holding itself upright. But her eyes, still alert, still watching her pup, hadn't dulled. Not yet. That's when the vet technician from Animal Control, a young woman named Eliza, knelt beside her. She didn't speak. She didn't try to touch her. She just placed a blanket nearby and waited. Nathan lowered himself as well. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. Eliza looked up. No collar, no chip, no records. If I had to guess. No one ever gave her one. Those words hit harder than expected. No name, no identity, just a body to be used, bred, caged, and forgotten. Nathan felt something crack inside his chest. A part of himself he'd spent years burying under the badge, under the uniform, under the calluses of a life in service. He glanced down at the puppy in his arms and then back at the mother. She had done everything she could with nothing. No help, no shelter, no one on her side. And somehow, against all odds, she'd kept him alive. "You have one now," Nathan whispered almost to himself. "Her name is—" He stopped, the word forming slowly in his mind, as if pulled from a place buried deep. He looked into her eyes again, and for the first time, she blinked without fear. "Call her Rhea," he said, barely above a breath. "She deserves a name that means strength." Eliza nodded, and just like that, she was no longer a number in a file or a cage without a name. She was Rhea, a mother, a fighter, a survivor. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise. Faint orange light seeped in through the cracks of the broken warehouse, casting a soft glow over the scene. But inside, something deeper was happening. Something neither police reports nor news stories would capture. This was more than a rescue. It was a reckoning, turning point, for Rhea, for her pup, and for Nathan. 3 days had passed since the raid on the warehouse, but for Nathan, it felt like a lifetime. He hadn't returned to regular duty. Not yet. The chief had insisted he take a few days to rest, to decompress, but Nathan wasn't sure what rest meant anymore. His sleep came in broken fragments, filled with images of cages, cries, and the look in Rhea's eyes when she lunged. Not from malice, but from something deeper, something primal, protective, unyielding. The city moved on like it always did. Headlines came and went, the suspects were processed and charged, and animal rights groups celebrated the dismantling of what turned out to be a regional dogfighting ring. There were talks of policy changes, crackdowns, reforms, but Nathan couldn't bring himself to care about the politics. All he could think about was that moment, the one where Rhea had chosen to stop. Not because she was forced, but because she understood, because she trusted him. Now, he stood just outside the local shelter, but not the public one. This was a private rescue facility run by volunteers and funded by donations. The place was quiet, peaceful, surrounded by open fields and clean, warm spaces for recovery. Inside, Kale waited in the patrol SUV. He'd sensed the tension in Nathan all morning. Dogs always knew. They didn't need words, just energy. And Nathan's was heavy. He stepped through the door, and the familiar scent of antiseptic and dry kibble met him. A receptionist greeted him quietly, already recognizing his face. "There in the back," she said with a smile. "She's been calmer since yesterday." Nathan nodded and made his way down the hall, passing kennels with names taped to the glass. Dogs in various stages of recovery, some wagging tails, others still too wounded to trust. When he reached the final room, he paused. Through the glass window, he saw her, Rhea, lying on a soft blanket, her body curled protectively around her pup, who now had a name of his own, Finn. The staff had been calling him that, and Nathan hadn't had the heart to change it. He liked how it sounded. Short, hopeful, like a second chance. Finn was bigger already, eating well, eyes brighter. But Rhea, her eyes still held that weight, that quiet sadness, the look of someone who had never had the choice to rest. Nathan opened the door slowly. She lifted her head but didn't rise. Her ears tilted back, not in fear, in recognition. He knelt down beside her, resting his hand gently near her paw. She didn't flinch. Finn looked up from her side, his tiny tail wagging once. It was the first time Nathan saw something close to peace in that room. "I've been thinking," he said softly, voice cracking under the emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "You don't belong here. Not in a cage. Not anymore. You did your job. You protected him. You survived everything they threw at you." He looked into her eyes, the same eyes that had once pierced through darkness and violence. "Now it's time someone fights for you." His voice barely a whisper, he said the words out loud for the first time, as if testing how they sounded in the world. "I want to adopt you, both of you, if you'll let me." She didn't move for several long seconds, but then she did. A slow inch forward, a soft whine, and finally, the weight in her chest seemed to fall away. She rested her head gently against his hand, and Nathan, the cop who had seen too much and felt too little for too long, felt something break open inside of him. 6 weeks later, the sun was setting behind a row of pines at the edge of Officer Nathan Doyle's property. The sky burned in soft orange and gold, casting long shadows across the open field where Cale, now off duty and relaxed, chased a tennis ball with uncharacteristic joy. A few feet away, Finn, all legs and floppy ears, tumbled through the grass, clumsy and free. But Nathan's eyes were on her. Rhea. She stood quietly near the porch, her posture regal, watchful, and still just a little guarded. But she wasn't the same dog Nathan had met in that warehouse. The haunted look in her eyes had softened, day by day, replaced by something far more powerful: trust. Not given easily, but earned through patience, consistency, and love she had never known before. Nathan sat on the steps, sipping coffee, his uniform now traded for an old hoodie and jeans. He watched the sunset, the dogs, the life that, only weeks ago, he never could have imagined himself part of. He had spent years running toward danger, always on the front lines, always ready to protect others. But what he never realized was that part of him had been longing to be saved, too. And somehow, without words, Rhea had done that. He thought back to the first night they brought her and Finn home. She hadn't slept. She paced the corners of the room, ears flicking at every sound. But Finn had curled into a blanket near the fireplace, and Cale had kept a quiet watch nearby. Nathan hadn't slept either. He just sat with her, all night. No leash, no commands, just presence. By morning, she had rested her head against his knee. It was the moment everything changed. Now they were a pack. Family. Unconventional. Scarred. But whole. Nathan looked down at the old ID tag he now kept on the porch table. It had belonged to a dog he'd lost years ago, in a case that still haunted him. A partner who died saving a child from a house fire. He had never replaced him. Until now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 new tags. One read Rhea Doyle. The other, Finn Doyle. He stood up and called softly, "Come here, girl." Rhea trotted over, slow but steady, her tail giving the gentlest wag. Nathan knelt down and clipped the tag onto her collar. "You're home now," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. "And no one's ever putting you in a cage again." Behind them, the last light of the day faded over the field, and for the first time in a long time, there was peace. Not the kind written in reports or filed in evidence boxes. The kind you feel in your bones. The kind that says you're safe, you're loved, you're home.